mother and daughter narrowly escape death after becoming the targets of an unknown gunman.
They didn't attempt to take the car. They didn't ask for any money.
I had 8 shell casings on the street. I was hoping they weren't hit that many times.
I thought, why would somebody want to shoot my daughter?
Their would-be killer is caught on tape.
Video depicted the suspect arrive and flee the scene after the shooting.
This was not a robbery. This was a straight-up execution.
But just as the health of one of the survivors improves, she vanishes.
I was thinking that whoever didn't finish the job, he found her.
The evidence leads detectives to a killer driven by jealousy and obsession.
They were in a dating relationship, but it was not public knowledge.
How come you didn't give her a ride home? She didn't want me to.
She loved her so much that she didn't want to see her be with anyone else. She's the worst of the worst.
We knew what the motive was. If I can't have you, no one can.
Tuesday, November 24th, 2015. It's a brisk fall evening in Linden, New Jersey, when emergency dispatchers receive a panicked call from a young woman.
Hello, 911. Please come to Valley Street, the corner of Valley Street and Coleman Street now, please. We just got shot in the car.
At approximately 7:16 p.m., Linden Central Dispatch, via police radio, broadcasted that there were shots fired on the 900 block of Middlesex Street.
We had 2 victims here, 2 victims.
The occupants of the vehicle were Tarita Julius and their daughter Chanel, who was 15 at the time.
Tarita Julius was the first victim. She's in the driver's seat of that car. She is gravely injured. She had attempted to drive away from the shooting area and then subsequently had crashed the car. Chanel had been hit. She'd been injured, but not as seriously injured as Tarita clearly was.
There were significant gunshot injuries to the torso area of Tarita Julius. She was in and out of consciousness. They knew that they needed to get medical attention.
As Tarita and Chanel are transported to the hospital, officers scour the scene for evidence to help them piece together what happened.
I had 8 shell casings on the street. I was hoping she wasn't hit that many times.
One specific neighbor was able to provide information about seeing a large male walking down the street and then eventually running back to a silver SUV-type car.
The second witness provided me with basically the same description. Large black man, heavy set.
The Linden Police Department canvassed the area for video surveillance recordings, and they were able to identify a video which depicted the suspect arrive and flee the scene after the shooting.
The video I recovered was in poor quality. It was very grainy, but you could see that it did fit the description provided by the witnesses. At this point, we canvassed additional areas. It's a big world out there. There's a lot of guys driving a silver vehicle.
As they conclude their initial sweep of the crime scene, investigators receive news from the hospital.
Tarita was shot 8 times, both in her chest and in her abdominal area.
Her injuries were significant. She was ultimately taken into surgery.
Police contact the victims' loved ones to inform them of the shooting.
My sister called me frantic, yelling, "You have to get to the hospital. Tarita was shot." Why would somebody want to shoot my daughter? So I just dropped everything, grabbed my coat.
Detectives also head to the hospital to speak with those waiting for news on Tarita and Chanel.
It's wildly important to get information about your victims to determine what might be the motivating factor for this type of violence. A lot of times in these cases, the victims don't survive. And so we're left with kind of filling the gaps and the holes by talking to, the next best thing, the people who are in their lives every day.
Tyrita Julius was born June 6, 1974, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Tyrita's father was not a constant in her life, so Tyrita's mother raised her with the help of her family.
I really wasn't a single parent. I had my mother, I had my brothers, I had my sister. So Tyrita never really wanted for nothing.
From that strong foundation, Tyrita grew into a confident and charismatic young woman.
She's very family-oriented, loved everyone around her, never really had a bad bone of hate in her body for anything. She just always wanted to see everybody around her succeed and just be together.
After graduating high school, Tyrita turned her love of caring for people into a career.
She was an administrative assistant, office administrator for Rutgers University Hospital.
While making plans for her future, she fell for a man named Jamar Colbert.
He was basically opposite of her. He was very laid back, low key. He wasn't like the party dance type. He would kind of just chill back with his shades and his drink.
Tyrita felt like her and Jamar would be together forever. And she never mentioned marriage, but she always talked about Jamar being her one and only.
They dated about maybe a year before she got pregnant. She got pregnant with Dante. Then a couple of years after that, she got pregnant with Chanel.
She loved her kids more than anything in this world. Dante and Chanel were her first worry about every and anything on this planet.
We were a real tight-knit family growing up, My mother's personality was huge, larger than life.
While Tyrita thrived as a parent, Jamar struggled with the expectations of fatherhood, and it took a toll on their relationship.
They were rocky. Ultimately, she just realized that he just wasn't for her. It wasn't a good fit. And they just decided to end the relationship.
Tyrita never shared how tough those times were. She always had a positive outlook and that there was a better outlook on the horizon. She dated after Jamar, and nothing that even compared to him, but I think, her kids were such a focus in her life that dating was just something that came second.
She put the work in. She was the service rep at the hospital.
She says, Mom, I want to get a big house so all of us can live together. She was getting her life together financially. She was just trying to reach that goal.
Now, everything Tyrita has built is at risk as she fights for her life. As Tyrita and her daughter Chanel undergo treatment at the hospital, detectives focus on their witness interviews and the viciousness of the attack to narrow down possible motives.
There's no indication that the person attempted to take anything. They didn't attempt to take the car.
In my mind, this was not a robbery. This was a straight-up execution. We wanted to know if Tyrita and Chanel had any kind of ongoing disputes with anybody in the neighborhood, family members, or anything that could lead us up to the fact of who would do this to them.
Coming up, Tyrita's loved ones provide detectives with some alarming connections.
When I heard she was in a motorcycle club, I immediately thought motorcycle gang and thought the worst, right?
and a potential motive is revealed.
They had displayed elements of jealousy and obsessiveness over Tyrita. There might be that animosity flowing.
41-year-old Tyrita Julius and her daughter, 15-year-old Chanel Colbert, are being treated for injuries they suffered during a brutal neighborhood shooting. Investigators at the hospital check to see if anyone is well enough to talk.
Chanel Colbert, take one, marker.
I was grazed on my mouth and on my wrist.
Do you remember how many times that guy shot you guys?
I believe it was like 8 or 9 shots.
Did you feel like you was lucky to only walk away with just a graze?
I felt extremely lucky. Like, extremely lucky. That evening, me and my mom were supposed to go to my brother's basketball game, which was normal for us. She had just got off of work. I was just getting out of school. She said she was gonna go out to pull the car around. As I was coming out, that's when I noticed a guy, like, walk around the car. As I was getting into the vehicle, I just remember as I was closing the door, looking over, and I seen the gun pointed into the window. I didn't even have a moment to think. I kind of like just went into shock, and I just remember us trying to take cover. I didn't realize that I was injured until I went to call 911. I was just concerned for my mom.
Investigators leave her to rest and learn that Tyrita survived her first surgery, but is still in the ICU on a ventilator and therefore unable to talk to them. Detectives turn to Tyrita's loved ones to find out if she has any enemies who might wish her harm.
Nothing made sense to me. Honestly, when I first heard of the event, I thought it was like, just a random act of violence who would want to hurt my mother and my sister.
But they share an unusual detail about her that catches the attention of detectives.
Tyrita was a member of the Rough Riders motorcycle club.
When I heard she was in a motorcycle club, I immediately thought motorcycle gang and thought the worst, right?
Police wonder if her association with the group led to violence. But when they locate members of the Rough Riders to interview, they find it's not quite what they expected.
Definitely not a bike gang. But with us, with Rough Riders as a lifestyle, we're closer to an SC, social clubs. Not all of our members have bikes, but they're still part of the lifestyle.
They did things in the community for the community. They weren't belligerent or violent.
We do book bag drives, we do feeding the homeless, passing out toiletries and stuff. You're actually doing something for people that are in need of it, and you can give it.
The Rough Riders say Tyrita grew especially close to one member, a woman named Jennifer Sweeney.
Jennifer Sweeney and Tyrita were in a dating relationship. It was known to the Rough Riders, known to certain members, and known to certain friends of Tyrita's, but it was not public knowledge to her family.
She never told me that they were involved. Something you just know, you can just put 2 and 2 together.
They said that they had been in a relationship for upwards of 3 years. And in fact, had started to end right before this shooting occurred.
As of the date of the shooting on November 24th of 2015, they were actually broken up, which was kind of the first sign of, okay, we got to look into this more.
In interviewing a few of the Rough Riders, it became known to us that they were at a fundraising event in New Jersey, and Jennifer was highly upset at this time because Tarita was dancing with a man named Hassan Nicely.
To investigators, it sounds like a potential motive.
Jennifer Sweeney had displayed elements of jealousy and obsessiveness over Tyrita. That's when they're kind of clued into the fact that there might be that animosity flowing. The event happened about 3 days before.
This information in itself is very important to us because now we're building a little bit of framework on the events leading up to the shooting. This possibly could be part of it.
New Jersey investigators are looking for the gunman that shot Tyrita Julius and her teenage daughter while they sat in a car outside their home. They explore the possibility that Tyrita's relationship with Jennifer Sweeney led to the attack, and they dig into Jennifer's life before she joined the Rough Riders.
Jen was a local girl from Tinton Falls and comes from a very good family. Her mother and her grandmother, both in the education business, and they were pretty high up.
She lived with her mother. Her mother was very involved in her life.
Despite that close relationship, Jennifer didn't follow the family legacy and become an educator.
Jennifer was a technician for a utility company. She had a decent job that she was there for many years. She was financially stable.
Her mother and family loved her. She was generally described as even-keeled. She's not a person who speaks too much or says too much. She got educated, an intelligent girl. On the peripheral, she rode motorcycles. She had some friends that rode motorcycles too. And some of them would ride with the Rough Riders.
Jen was brought in by a previous member. She's always quiet. She would keep to herself until she got to know you.
We had to get her out of her shell a little bit, you know. But after that, we got to know her, and she was cool. You could talk to her and make jokes.
Tyrita's outgoing personality helped break through Jennifer's shy nature, and their friendship quickly turned romantic.
In the beginning, Tyrita, she enjoyed being around Jen. They hung out a lot.
So I thought they were just friends, and then they got close. Like, okay, now y'all besties. But after that, I found out, like, oh, you know, okay, cool. Like, it makes sense now, because they was close. They looked great together, you know. That she brought a smile on Jennifer's face. Jennifer made sure she was smiling.
However, friends say Jennifer's dependence on Tyrita bordered on obsession, and Tyrita eventually broke things off.
Jen was overprotective. She was always the one sitting next to Tyrita, said, you can't do this, you can't do that.
Tyrita was just tired of the arguments. Tyrita didn't want to be controlled.
And when Tyrita moved on to a man, Jennifer did not seem happy about it.
It became known that by August, she was indeed dating Hassan Nicely. So with that, I wanted to now speak with Jennifer Sweeney.
What the detective was trying to do is figure out, you know, where she was on the night of the shooting.
She was very calm, noticeably upset, concerned, and more than willing to help.
She said that she was the only woman that Tyrita had ever been with. Jennifer did admit that there had been about 3 days prior to the shooting that they had not been speaking, or that they had been on a break, as she worded it.
She advised me that on the night of the shooting, she was en route to Linden because it was a Tuesday, and that was their normal meeting night. She received a phone call from a fellow club member who advised her that Tyrita was shot.
They detoured and she went right to the hospital.
The timeline puts Jennifer nowhere near the scene of the shooting. Plus, surveillance video and eyewitness statements show a male shooter. So investigators rule her out for the time being. 10 days after the attack, there is miraculous news from the hospital. Tyrita is awake and is going to survive the shooting.
I was there, and first thing she said was, "With my kids, how's Chanel?"
It was extremely relieving for me. That was just the only thing I wanted to hear, that she made it out and would be okay.
Tyrita is also well enough to speak with detectives at the hospital.
My initial contact with Tyrita, she had difficulty breathing, she was struggling to speak. So we just went for the basics. Do you have any problems with anybody?
Tyrita is open about the tensions in her relationship with Jennifer.
At this time, she felt that Jen would not have been behind the shooting.
She was just as in the dark as everybody else about who would have wanted her dead.
As detectives work to formulate new leads, Tyrita continues her recovery and Jennifer remains by her side.
Tyrita felt obligated to have Jen there because she felt like Jen was there for her throughout the whole ordeal. I don't know if they were still like romantically like there, but she wanted her there, I guess, as a friend.
Jennifer would call and tell us updates on her. Jennifer made it seem like she was back. Her and Tyrita was back together because of all the stuff she, Jennifer was doing with being at the hospital.
Jennifer was showing people pictures of engagement rings that she was getting for her. So without Tyrita's input, Jennifer decided that they were back together and told other people that they were together.
39 days after the incident, in January, Tyrita was released from the hospital. She was in not best of condition at this time.
It was decided by her family that she was going to go stay at her mom's house.
2 months pass without any progress identifying the shooter. Then, in March 2016, 3.5 months after Tyrita was first shot, the case takes an alarming new turn.
Well, my aunt received the phone call that my mom was missing. She had went out and she did not make it back home.
Coming up, Tyrita's disappearance renews efforts to identify her shooter.
When I came home, she wasn't there.
We know that Tyrita is not answering her phone.
And a new suspect emerges.
You could see his whole demeanor just changed. He was, "Oh, they got me."
On March 9th, 2016, Queen Julius, the mother of shooting victim Tyrita Julius, contacts investigators. She says that over the past few months, Tyrita's recovery had been difficult.
She was very dependent on others. Her arm was stiff, and she really couldn't do nothing for herself. So you had to Cook, feed her, help her bathe.
Jen was just there as her partner, you know. She was playing the role of caring, being there, you know, help her with her daily needs.
But now, Queen is worried something else has happened to her daughter.
March the 8th, I got up and I told Tyree before I went to work, I said, get up and move that arm. When I came home, she wasn't there. So I called Jen and I said, Jen, is Tyree with you? She said, no, I dropped her off at the train station.
She had dropped her off at the Long Branch train station at approximately 7:02, 7:03 p.m. with the means of taking a 7:17 train back to Linden.
Then I asked her, I said, well, why would you drop her off at the train station if you picked her up from home? And she said, well, she told me to drop her off there.
We, as an investigative group, found this kind of odd, being that she was recently shot and her shooter has not yet been apprehended.
I was thinking that whoever they didn't get got her. The person that didn't finish the job, he found her.
It was vitally important to talk to Jennifer Sweeney because she's the last person to have seen her.
You went down and picked her up?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. What time was that about?
Like 11:50 something.
Jennifer explained that they ran a few errands in the evening hours. Jennifer had driven Tyrita to the Long Branch train station to drop her off so that she could return home to Linden.
How come you didn't give her a ride home?
She didn't want me to.
Tyrita insisted that she be dropped off as she didn't want to inconvenience Jennifer from having to travel back to her home.
What train did she attempt to catch, you think?
I think it's the 7:17. I wasn't paying attention to the time, but that was the next one that came.
She indicated that after dropping Tyrita off, she went to her friend Donna Hafner's house in Long Branch. Donna was not home at the time, so Jennifer said she remained there for approximately 1 hour with Donna's husband.
Jennifer was cooperative and she was committed to assisting us in locating Tyrita.
While Jennifer is not considered to be a suspect in Tyrita's disappearance, investigators want to confirm the details of her statement.
We wanted to go back and search her vehicle and her house just to ensure that everything that she had told us was factually accurate.
They were able to find a receipt from Ichiban which showed that, they had been there. They were able to corroborate that the two of them went to the DMV together because they had video from inside and everything appeared normal.
When detectives follow up with Jennifer's friend, Donna Hafner, she confirms that Jennifer visited her husband that evening, but admits it was very odd.
Jennifer did not particularly get along with Donna's husband, Junior.
Jennifer ended up awkwardly sitting with Donna's husband for a good amount of time before then leaving.
Detectives suspect Jennifer may have been trying to create an alibi for the night of Tyrita's disappearance.
Our next efforts were focused on reviewing video surveillance recordings in an effort to locate Tyrita or Jennifer traveling to the Long Branch train station.
The footage ultimately makes extremely clear that neither Jen Sweeney nor Tyrita Julius was ever there on March 8th, 2016.
Being the last person that saw her alive and then having her give information that is inconsistent with known evidence, that's going to lead them to be suspicious of her.
After uncovering evidence that Jennifer Sweeney lied about the disappearance of Tyrita Julius, investigators revisit the possibility she was also involved in the shooting that took place 4 months prior.
We decided to go to the phones. Communication data warrant was prepared for Jennifer Sweeney's telephone number.
Records show Jennifer added Tyrita to her account, giving her full access to Tyrita's phone.
She was really utilizing that to really stalk where she was and who she was talking to.
One of the numbers belongs to the man Tyrita's friends said Jennifer became jealous over.
The night before the shooting, she is constantly calling Hassan Nicely's phone, like star 6-7ing the number, basically blocking a number so that they can't see who's calling, building herself up, like basically into a fury that whole night.
Though he ignored Jennifer's harassing calls, the same pattern repeated just before Tyrita vanished.
February 1st, there was a bevy of lookups in these phone finders and things like that where she's starting to do intel.
That leads us to believe that she was becoming more and more jealous in the days before both the shooting and then the disappearance.
However, the most damning evidence comes from Jennifer's GPS data.
Jennifer Sweeney's phone was accessing cell phone towers in the Linden area the same time that Tyrita was shot. This was contrary to what Jennifer had told us when we first met with her.
The data showed that she'd been lying, and she was at the same tower at the same time that Tyrita was.
Not only was Jen in Linden, but she was speaking to an individual with a prepaid cell phone. She spoke to this individual 19 times on the day of the shooting and 25 times the following day.
Investigators track the prepaid cell phone to a user named Andre Harris.
We learned that Jen Sweeney and Andre Harris went to high school together. They were friends for sure. Somewhat more recently, they kind of reconnected a little bit. From first glance, he certainly fits the general description of what we were given for the shooting. Andre Harris is a big guy, and he happened to drive a silver vehicle.
They also were able to look at the location of his cell phone around the time of the shooting. His phone is at the same tower location that Jennifer Sweeney's is and that Tyrita Julius is. So that puts them all in the same area at the same time on the night of the shooting.
We found that he had an outstanding Long Branch warrant for his arrest. At this point, a motor vehicle stop was effectuated by a marked unit, and he was taken into custody.
He was questioned about his relationship, if any, with Tyrita Julius, as well as his relationship with Jennifer Sweeney. And he provides information that he does, in fact, know Jennifer Sweeney. He considers her to be an acquaintance that he's had for a long time.
Andre claims he does not know Tyrita and denies the evidence placing him near the scene of the shooting.
While interviewing Andre, there were search warrants prepared for Andre, his vehicle, and his residence. The field team was out there. We received a phone call advising that they had located human remains in the yard of Andre's residence.
Once myself and Detective Mikolajczyk were informed about the information, and we were then able to confront Andre Harris.
You could see his whole demeanor just changed. He was, oh, they got me.
While Andre initially denied having any information, he ultimately confessed it was Tyrita Julius's remains that were buried on his property.
Andre admits to being the gunman in the shooting 9 months earlier, but insists Jennifer is the one who killed Tyrita.
He said on the evening of the homicide, Jen appeared at his door. She had called him shortly before, saying, hey, gonna stop by. This was highly unusual because he tells me he tries to keep his distance from Jennifer. She asked him for a cord. She gives him apparently the explanation she's having issues with her trunk. so he supplies her with a white electrical cord.
She took the cord and went back to her vehicle, where she remained for several minutes.
He's wondering what Jen's doing out there. He exited his home, and at this time, he noticed that Tarita was in the front seat with an electrical cord wrapped around her neck. Jen is now pointing a gun at him, demanding he dig a grave.
The details Andre provides are vague, but evidence from the gravesite seems to confirm his statement.
Tarita is found inside two trash bags, and the electrical cord was still wrapped around her neck.
He has no known connection or really anything to do with Tarita Julius, which tells us that the motive is still lying with Jennifer Sweeney.
Now we're thinking, why would Jen kill Tarita in such a fashion? Because Jen's intention was to propose to Tarita. She also wanted Tarita to move in with her, but Tarita wasn't quite ready for this yet because she wasn't healthy. Maybe what triggered it this day was she did propose, or she did ask Tarita to move in with her, but something occurred that Jen did a full 180 on. Shortly after this interview, Jennifer was placed into custody.
Andre Harris and Jennifer Sweeney were charged with the murder and desecration of human remains of Tarita Julius.
When they told us that they found Tarita, I just held my brother. I just couldn't even think at that point in time. I just felt numb.
It's hard. Your child's supposed to outlive you. You're not supposed to bury your child.
Prosecutors begin preparing the case for trial. But without direct evidence tying Jennifer to the murder, they know the outcome is less than certain.
Even if you think you have the strongest case imaginable, you never know what's going to happen with the jury.
Following his arrest, Andre Harris, the confessed shooter of Tarita Julius and Chanel Colbert, accepts a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Jennifer Sweeney.
He pled guilty to the attempted murder of Tarita Julius, and he was sentenced to 16 years of New Jersey State Prison.
Naturally, we ask Andre, how did you ever get involved in this?
He told us that Jennifer Sweeney was threatening basically his life and his kids. She would make mention to him that she knew where his kids were at school or what they were doing.
Jennifer just couldn't take that Tarita wasn't happy. You couldn't take the rejection.
She enlisted Andre Harris to shoot her. And Jen had to kind of play her role as the caring girlfriend. I think maybe even legitimately, Jen tried to make it work, but ultimately, she got suspicious again and killed Tarita in Andre Harris's driveway and made him bury the body.
He said, I went along with it because I had no choice. It was either my people or Tarita, and I don't know Tarita.
After multiple delays, the trial finally gets underway in August 2021. Prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of a woman driven by jealousy to commit murder.
We knew what the motive was. If I can't have you, no one can.
She did plan on proposing. She had showed several of her friends an engagement ring she wanted.
But Tarita was moving on. Jennifer snapped because she loved Tarita so much that she didn't want to see her be with anyone else. She was that jealous, and she couldn't handle her moving on.
But the defense argues that the evidence proves Jennifer had nothing to do with Tyrita's death.
Andre, we know, attempted to murder Tyrita up in Linden, and then second time, her body is dead in the backyard of his house, having been choked to death. Our theory was that Andre was jealous of Tyrita because he wanted to have a relationship with Jen. So he was wiping out the competition.
On September 3rd, 2021, the jury renders its verdict.
Jen Sweeney was found guilty of every count of the indictment except the attempted murder charge against, as it related to Chanel Colbert, was dismissed.
In May 2022, she is sentenced to 95 years in prison.
Jennifer's sentence I found fair. I want her to be in jail, in prison, suffering for the rest of her life. She should never see the light of day.
She's the worst of the worst. I just couldn't fathom how she could just sit up in my house and look in Tyrita's face and all the time knowing what you did, the shooting, and then plotting this.
My mom was like the glue. She made sure we stayed in contact with each other. She just set things up so that we can be a family.
My grandmother, she lost her daughter. We lost our mother. It's a huge loss, you know what I mean? And all for what? For nothing. For nothing.
My cousin asked me one time, well, how can we get the old you back? And I told him, that part is gone. I don't think that part is ever coming back.
California, summer 1998. Heat pressed down on the asphalt like a weight, trapping every sound, every breath, every secret beneath it. The kind of afternoon where nothing moves unless it has to. The kind of place where people believe, quietly, confidently, that nothing bad ever really happens. Until something does. It didn't begin with a scream. It didn't begin with a witness. It began with something far more subtle. Something almost forgettable. A smell. At first, it was easy to ignore. A faint intrusion in the air. Sweet but wrong. Lingering too long. The neighbor noticed it while watering the lawn, pausing for just a second, brow tightening, instinct whispering that something wasn't right. But instinct is easy to dismiss, until it isn't. Hours passed. The smell didn't fade. It grew heavier. By the time the call was made, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across a street that looked untouched by anything unusual. Perfect lawns, closed garages, silence that felt ordinary until you listened too closely. Police arrived without urgency. Not yet. That changed the moment the door opened. Inside, the air was still, thick, unmoving, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if the house itself is holding something back. No signs of forced entry.
No chows.
No overturned furniture screaming of a struggle. Just stillness. And at the center of it, a body. She was 27 years old, known in the neighborhood, friendly, predictable, the kind of person whose routines form quiet patterns, patterns that, once broken, are impossible to ignore. She hadn't shown up for work. She hadn't answered calls. She hadn't been seen. Now she was here. And everything about the scene raised the same question, over and over again.
How?
How does something like this happen without noise, without resistance, without anyone noticing? Detectives moved carefully, each step measured, each glance deliberate. Flashlights cut through dim corners. Cameras captured everything in cold, precise bursts of light. Evidence bags filled slowly, methodically, with fragments that might, or might not, matter. There were no obvious answers. But there were details. A chair slightly out of place. Not overturned. Just wrong. A faint mark near the doorway. Easy to miss. Easier to dismiss. But once seen, impossible to ignore. And then there was something else. Something invisible. Something that didn't shout, but whispered. DNA. In 1998, it was a promise more than a solution. A tool that could change everything or nothing at all. It depended on one thing, a match. They collected what they could. Skin cells, fibers, traces left behind by someone who had been there, but had no intention of being known. And then the waiting began. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Interviews stacked up, one after another. Neighbors who had seen nothing. Friends who knew nothing. Co-workers who couldn't imagine why anyone would want to hurt her. Each statement added weight to the same conclusion.
No motive. No suspect.
No clear path forward. The case didn't collapse, it just stalled. But outside the investigation, something else was happening.
Fear.
It spread quietly at first, then all at once. Because the details didn't make sense. No forced entry.
No noise. No witnesses.
It suggested something far more unsettling than a random act of violence. It suggested access. It suggested familiarity. It suggested that whoever had done this had walked in like they belonged there. And walked out the same way. The media picked it up fast. Headlines sharp, urgent, impossible to ignore. California cold case in the making. The phrase landed hard, too early, too certain. But it lingered. Cold case. Two words that carry a kind of finality no one wants to accept. Not at the beginning. Not when everything still feels solvable. But as leads faded and time stretched thin, those words became harder to argue against. Because nothing held. A car seen passing through the neighborhood, never identified. A man reported by one witness, described differently by another. A phone call that led nowhere. Every lead dissolved under pressure. And still the DNA sat there.
Logged.
Preserved. Waiting. Waiting for a name that didn't exist. The first year ended without answers. The second passed more quietly. By the third, the case had begun to slip from public memory. The cameras disappeared. The headlines stopped. The street returned to its version of normal. But not completely. Because something had changed. Doors stayed locked now. Lights stayed on longer. People noticed things they used to ignore. Because once you know something like this can happen, you can't unknow it. Inside the department, the case file thickened. Notes layered over notes. Photographs aging at the edges. Evidence cataloged and sealed. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, attention shifted elsewhere. New cases. New victims. New urgency. This one waited. Detectives moved on. Some retired. Some transferred. Fresh eyes reviewed old details, searching for something that had been missed. But the conclusion never changed. Unknown offender. Unknown motive. Case inactive. Cold. And yet something about it resisted that label. Maybe it was the precision, the lack of chaos, the way everything felt controlled, too controlled. Maybe it was the absence of panic in the scene. Or maybe it was a feeling unspoken, but shared by more than one investigator, that this wasn't chance. This was intention. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and believed completely that they had gotten away with it. Years turned into decades. The world moved forward. Technology evolved. Databases grew. DNA profiling became sharper, faster, more powerful. But none of it mattered without a match. The evidence remained
silent.
Until something changed. Not with noise, not with urgency, just a quiet shift buried deep within systems most people never think about. A new approach. Genetic genealogy. It wasn't about suspects anymore. It was about connections, distant ones, fragments of shared DNA linking strangers through generations. The sample from 1998 was uploaded.
No expectations.
Just one more attempt. Then, a hit. Not a direct match, but close enough to matter. A distant relative, third cousin, maybe further, a thread thin, fragile, but real. Investigators began the process. Building family trees, expanding branches, tracing names backward, then forward, mapping lives that had nothing to do with the crime until they did. It was slow, painfully slow. Every name had to be checked, every possibility tested, every assumption challenged. Months passed, then years, until the tree narrowed. And one name remained. He wasn't remarkable. That was the first thing. No violent history, no record that stood out, no reason for suspicion. He had lived quietly, blended in, existed in the background of everything. The kind of person no one looks at twice. But the details aligned.
Age.
Location.
Opportunity.
And when investigators finally obtained a fresh DNA sample, there was no uncertainty. It matched.
Perfectly.
After decades, the unknown had a name. And everything shifted. The silence that had protected him for so long broke. The arrest didn't come with drama. No sirens screaming through the night.
No chase.
No resistance.
Just a moment.
Ordinary on the surface. Extraordinary beneath it. Neighbors watched as he was taken away.
Confusion.
Disbelief.
Shock.
Because they knew him. Or thought they did. And as the news spread, the words returned, stronger than before. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA match exposes killer after decades in hiding. But behind the headline was something heavier. Because this wasn't just about one victim. It was about time. About patience. About the idea that nothing truly disappears. That even the smallest trace can wait quietly for decades until the world is finally ready to understand what it means. And somewhere, in evidence rooms lit by fluorescent lights that never go dark, there are more cases like this. More names without answers. More stories paused in the middle. Waiting. For the moment they begin again. The name didn't explode into the world all at once. It surfaced slowly. First inside a report, then across a desk, then in a room where no one spoke for several seconds longer than they should have. Because after 25 years of silence, the moment a name appears, everything changes. It wasn't just a suspect anymore. It was a person. A man who had lived through the years that were supposed to expose him. A man who had built a life in the shadow of something no one around him could see. A man who had woken up every morning, gone about his routine, spoken to neighbors, smiled when expected while carrying a secret buried so deep it had outlived an entire era of investigation. Detectives didn't rush. They couldn't. Because this was the moment where everything had to be perfect. One mistake, one assumption unchecked, one piece of procedure skipped, and the case could collapse all over again. So they watched him. Quietly.
Carefully.
They built a new timeline, not of the crime, but of his life. where he had lived in 1998, who he had known, what his routines had been, whether he had ever crossed paths with the victim in a way no one had noticed before. Every detail, every movement, every gap that might reveal something or destroy everything. At first glance, nothing stood out. That was the unsettling part. No obvious connection, no shared workplace, no documented relationship, no reason on paper for their lives to intersect. And yet the DNA said otherwise, which meant one thing. The connection existed. It just hadn't been seen. Investigators went deeper. Old records were pulled from storage, addresses cross-referenced, maps redrawn. They began reconstructing a version of 1998 that no longer existed, street by street, building by building, memory by memory. And slowly patterns began to form. He had been closer than anyone realized. Not in a way that triggered alarms. Not in a way that left a trail obvious enough to follow. But close enough. Close enough to know the area. Close enough to understand the rhythms of the neighborhood. Close enough to move without drawing attention. Close enough to walk in and walk out. That realization shifted the entire weight of the case. Because it meant this hadn't been random. This had been deliberate. Calculated. And that raised a question no one could comfortably answer. Had he done it before? Or worse, had he done it again? The possibility lingered in every conversation, every report, every late-night review of evidence. Because if he had been capable of this once undetected, then the silence that followed wasn't reassurance. It was a gap. A gap wide enough to hide anything. Investigators began searching beyond the case itself. Other unsolved crimes, similar patterns, similar methods, cases that had faded into the same quiet obscurity. They looked for overlaps, geographic, behavioral, forensic. But nothing definitive surfaced. No second victim that could be tied directly. No pattern that could be proven. Just the same haunting uncertainty that had followed the case from the beginning. Maybe this had been the only time. Or maybe it was the only time he had left something behind. The surveillance continued. Days turned into weeks. He went about his life. Unaware or pretending to be. He drove the same routes, visited the same places, spoke to the same people. Nothing about his behavior suggested panic. No sudden changes. No attempts to disappear.
If he knew he didn't show it.
And that, more than anything, made him dangerous. Because it meant one of two things. Either he believed he was still invisible, or he had spent 25 years learning how to live like he was. The decision to move forward came quietly. A warrant. A plan. A moment chosen not for drama, but for control. When they approached him, there were no raised voices.
No chaos.
Just a calm, deliberate presence that closed in from all sides at once. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't ask why. He just looked. For a second too long. As if something deep inside him had already understood. As if the past, buried for decades, had finally reached the surface, and he had been expecting it. The arrest was clean.
Precise.
Final. And yet, it was only the beginning. Because once he was in custody, the questions that had haunted the case for decades demanded answers. Why her? How had he chosen her? What had happened inside that house in the final moments before everything went silent? Interrogation began almost immediately. A room, a table, a recorder. The same setup used thousands of times before, but this time the weight was different. Because across from them wasn't just a suspect. It was the answer to a question that had refused to die. At first he said nothing. Not denial. Not confusion. Just silence. A silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. Detectives pressed carefully. They laid out what they had. The timeline. The location. The DNA. Each piece placed on the table with precision, not aggression. Because this wasn't about forcing a confession. It was about breaking through something that had been sealed for 25 years. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what they expected.
No immediate admission. No emotional collapse.
Just a question. Quiet. Measured. How did you find me? It hung in the air. Because in that moment, something became clear. He hadn't been wondering if he would be caught. He had been wondering when. And now he had his answer. The interrogation shifted. Not toward proving guilt, that was already done. But toward understanding. And understanding, in cases like this, is rarely clean. His statements came in fragments. Incomplete. Sometimes contradictory. Memory blurred by time, or shaped by something else entirely. He described the night in pieces. Disconnected details that didn't immediately form a full picture. A movement here. A decision there. Moments that seemed small but carried enormous weight. There was no clear motive. Not one that fit neatly into a report. No argument that escalated. No relationship that turned violent. No single trigger that explained everything. Just a sequence of choices. One after another. Leading to a point of no return. And then silence. Again. As if even now, with everything exposed, there were parts of it he would never fully reveal. Outside the interrogation room, the impact was spreading. The victim's family received the news in a way no one can prepare for. Relief mixed with something heavier. Because closure doesn't erase time. It doesn't give back the years. It doesn't answer every question. It just replaces one kind of uncertainty with another. For the community, the shock was immediate. Because the idea that someone could live among them for decades, carrying something like this, was harder to process than the crime itself. Neighbors replayed every interaction. Every conversation. Every passing moment that now felt different in hindsight. Searching for signs that had never been visible. And finding none. Because that was the truth. He hadn't stood out. He hadn't made mistakes anyone could see. He had simply existed.
And that was enough.
As the case moved toward trial, the story grew louder. Not just as a headline, but as a symbol. Of what time can erase. Of what technology can uncover. Of how the smallest fragment of evidence can outlast decades of silence. But beneath all of that, the core remained unchanged. A life taken. A question asked. An answer delayed. And a truth that, no matter how long it hides, doesn't disappear. Because somewhere, in the quiet space between past and present, there is always something waiting. Waiting to be found. Waiting to be understood. Waiting to be remembered. The room felt smaller the longer he sat in it. Not physically, not in any way that could be measured, but something about the air, heavy, unmoving, made it feel like the walls were slowly pressing inward, forcing everything hidden to the surface. The recorder stayed on. A low, constant presence. Red light steady. Listening. Across the table, detectives didn't rush. They had learned that time, in moments like this, wasn't an enemy. It was a tool. Silence wasn't empty. It was pressure. And pressure reveals things. He leaned back slightly, not relaxed, not tense, just controlled. The same control that had defined everything about the case from the beginning.
No sudden movements.
No wasted words. A man who had spent decades living inside a version of reality where nothing slipped.
Until now.
How did you find me? The questions still lingered, echoing in the space between them. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was calculation. Because what he was really asking was how his invisibility had failed. Detectives answered carefully. Not everything. Not all at once. Just enough. DNA. A match. Technology that didn't exist in 1998. Connections that reached through time, through people he had never met, through fragments of identity he didn't even know he had left behind. They watched his face as they spoke. Looking for cracks. Looking for the moment when understanding shifted into realization. It came quietly. A slight tightening around the eyes. A pause that lasted just a fraction longer than it should have. The kind of reaction most people would never notice, but in this room, nothing was missed. He nodded once.
Slow.
As if confirming something to himself. Not surprised that he had been caught.
Only surprised by how.
And that detail mattered. Because it meant he had always known this moment was possible. He had just believed it wouldn't happen like this. The conversation moved forward. Not aggressively, not confrontational. Measured. They didn't accuse. They didn't push for immediate confession. They built a structure, piece by piece, placing facts in front of him with precision, letting the weight of evidence do what force never could. The night of 1998 returned. Not as memory, but as reconstruction.
They laid out the timeline.
The last confirmed sighting. The estimated time of death. The physical evidence recovered from the scene. Every detail aligned in a way that left no space for doubt. And still he didn't deny it. But he didn't fully admit it either. What came instead was something stranger. Fragments. Pieces of recollection that surfaced without context, without emotion, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. A distance in his voice that made everything feel colder. He spoke about the street first. How quiet it had been. How nothing moved. How easy it was to exist in a place like that without being noticed. Then the house. Not the inside. Not yet. Just the outside. The way it looked. The way it felt. The way it didn't seem like a place where anything bad could happen. There was a pause. Longer this time. The kind that stretches until it forces the next words out. Then. I didn't think anyone would hear anything. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't justification. It was a statement. Flat. Controlled. And it changed everything. Because it confirmed what had always been suspected. This hadn't been spontaneous. It had been anticipated. Planned, at least in part. He knew the environment. He understood the risk. And he had calculated it. Detectives leaned in, not physically, but in attention. Every word now carried weight. They asked about the victim. What he knew. How he had chosen her. Another pause. This one different. Less controlled. Less certain. I saw her before. Simple. But not simple at all. Because that single sentence closed a gap that had existed for decades. There had been a connection. Not documented. Not recognized. But real. He had seen her. Somewhere. At some point. Enough to remember. Enough to act. The details remained unclear. He didn't or wouldn't expand. Whether it was a moment passing on the street, a routine observed from a distance, or something deeper at stayed just out of reach. And maybe it always would. The interrogation continued like that. A slow uncovering. Not of a full narrative, but of pieces. Moments that hinted at a larger picture without ever fully revealing it. He described entering the house.
Not how.
Not exactly. Just that he had. That it had been quiet. That she hadn't expected him. And then, nothing. The most critical moment, the point where everything changed, remained buried in silence. Detectives pressed.
Carefully. They circled back.
Reframed questions. Shifted angles. Tried to break through the wall he had built over 25 years. But it held. Not perfectly. But enough. Because what he gave them was never complete. Always partial. Always just enough to confirm, but never enough to fully understand. And maybe that was the most unsettling part. Because after all this time, after all the waiting, the truth was still incomplete. Outside the room, the case was already moving. Evidence re-examined. Statements reviewed. Old interviews pulled back into focus under a new light. Everything that had once seemed irrelevant now mattered. People who had spoken to investigators decades ago were contacted again. Memories resurfaced. Some clearer. Some distorted by time. But all of them now connected to a name. A real one. Not a ghost. And with that, the narrative began to shift. Because this wasn't just an unsolved mystery anymore. It was a story with an ending. But not a clean one. Not one that answered everything. The victim's family sat with that reality. Hearing details they had waited decades to know. And discovering that some questions would never be answered. Why her? Why that night? Why at all? The answers, if they existed, were locked somewhere between what he remembered and what he chose not to say. And that space, uncertain, incomplete, became part of the case itself.
À permanent absence.
As the interrogation stretched into hours, then days, a pattern emerged. He wasn't breaking. Not in the way people expect.
No sudden confession. No emotional collapse.
Just a gradual release of information. Controlled. Measured. Almost deliberate. As if even now he was deciding what the world was allowed to know. And what it wasn't. At one point, he stopped speaking entirely. Sat still. Eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. And for a moment, it felt like everything had reached its limit. Then he said something that shifted the air again. I thought it was over. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just certain. And in that moment, the full weight of the past became visible. Because for 25 years, he had believed exactly that. That it was over. That the silence would hold. That whatever had happened in that house in 1998 would stay there. But it hadn't. It had waited. In evidence. In memory. In fragments of DNA too small to see, but too real to disappear. And now, sitting in that room, facing the consequences of something that had outlived time itself. He was confronting the one thing he hadn't planned for. The future. A future where the past didn't stay buried. Where answers came even after decades. Where silence wasn't enough. The recorder kept running. Capturing every word. Every pause. Every fragment of a truth that had taken 25 years to reach this point. And as the interrogation continued, one thing became clear. This case had never really been cold. It had just been waiting. waiting for the moment when the world could finally see what had been there all along.
Hidden.
Patient. Unfinished.
Until now.
By the time the fourth day of questioning began, the room had changed. Not in structure, not in light, the same table, the same chairs, the same low hum of fluorescent bulbs that never quite let you forget where you were. But something in the air had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like pressure building before a storm that never announces itself. He looked different. Not weaker, not broken, but altered. Because the space between who he had been for 25 years and who he was now had finally collapsed. There was no more distance left to hide in. The detectives noticed it immediately. The way his posture had changed. The way his eyes no longer drifted toward the corners of the room, searching for something to anchor to. Now he stayed focused, present, as if the weight of everything had pulled him fully into the moment. And once someone reaches that point, the truth starts to move. Not all at once, but enough. The recorder clicked on again. Red light steady. Listening. They didn't begin with questions. They let the silence settle first. Because by now, silence wasn't empty space, it was expectation. It forced him to decide whether to speak or carry the weight alone. He exhaled slowly.
Long.
Controlled. Then leaned forward just slightly, elbows resting on the table. And for the first time since the interrogation began, he didn't wait for them. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The sentence landed without warning.
No build-up. No hesitation.
Just a fracture in the control he had held for decades. Detectives stayed still.
No interruption.
No reaction that might break the flow. Because this was the moment they had been waiting for. Not a confession forced under pressure, but something voluntary. Something real. He continued. Not in a rush, not in panic, but with a steadiness that felt different from before, less calculated, more inevitable. I didn't go there planning. He stopped, searching for the word, that. A pause.
Short.
But heavy. I just wanted to see if it was possible. The statement didn't clarify anything. It complicated everything. Because possible could mean anything. Possible to enter. Possible to remain unseen. Possible to test a boundary that had only existed in thought before that night. Detectives let him continue. And slowly, the outline of something darker began to form. He had noticed her before. More than once. Not in a way that would stand out. Not in a way that would trigger suspicion. Just moments. Glimpses. Fragments of routine that, over time, became familiar. He had learned the patterns. When she left. When she returned. When the house was quiet. When it wasn't. Nothing formal. Nothing deliberate in the beginning. Just observation. And observation became curiosity. Curiosity became intent. I knew the door, he said quietly, wasn't always locked. Another piece. Another shift. Because now the image of that night wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was access. He had seen an opportunity. And he had taken it. The room seemed to narrow as he spoke, each detail pulling everything closer together. The unknown was shrinking, replaced by something far more unsettling, understanding. But understanding didn't make it easier. It made it worse. Because it meant this had been preventable in ways no one could have anticipated. He described the moment he entered.
Slow.
Careful. Listening. Expecting nothing. And then, everything changed. She was there. The words were almost flat, but the impact was immediate. Because in that instant, the entire plan, if it could even be called that, collapsed. This wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't expected her to be home. Or, if he hadn't expected to be seen. And once that happened, there was no version of events that ended quietly. The detectives didn't need him to describe the rest in detail. They had the evidence. The timeline. The physical reality of what had occurred. But hearing him approach it, circle it, without fully stepping into it created a tension that no report could capture. I didn't think, he said. Another pause. Longer. More fragile. I just reacted. The word hung there. Reacted. A simple word used to explain something irreversible. Something that had echoed through decades. And even now it felt incomplete. Because reaction implies a moment. A split second. But everything leading up to it had been building long before that night. The detectives shifted slightly. Not to interrupt, but to guide. They asked about what happened after. The silence returned. Different this time. He leaned back again, eyes dropping to the table. For the first time, there was hesitation. Real hesitation. Not strategic. Not controlled. But something closer to reluctance. Because this part, the aftermath, was where intention returned. Where choices became clear again. I made sure he stopped. Adjusted his hands. Started again. I made sure it looked like nothing. And suddenly everything about the scene made sense. The lack of chaos. The absence of forced entry. The quiet. The stillness. It hadn't been accidental. It had been constructed. A deliberate effort to erase the moment that had spun out of control. To restore the illusion of normal. To walk away without leaving a trace that anyone could follow. Except he had. One trace. Invisible at the time. Unavoidable in the end. DNA. The one thing he couldn't see. The one thing he couldn't control. The one thing that had waited 25 years to bring him back into this room. The realization seemed to settle over him as the conversation continued. Not suddenly, but gradually. Like a weight redistributing itself. Because for decades, he had lived with the belief that he had succeeded. That he had managed the situation. That he had contained it. But now sitting here, hearing the evidence, laid out understanding how he had been found. That belief was unraveling.
Piece by piece.
Outside the room, the case was transforming again. What had once been theory was now confirmed. What had once been speculation was now fact. The narrative was solidifying. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to stand. And yet, even with everything he was saying, there were still gaps. Important ones. Why he chose her specifically. Why he returned to that street at all. Whether the act had been purely opportunistic or something more. Questions that hovered just out of reach. Questions he didn't answer. Maybe couldn't. Or wouldn't. Because even now control hadn't fully disappeared. He was still deciding where the line was. Still holding something back. And maybe that was the final truth of the case. That no matter how much time passed, no matter how much evidence emerged, there would always be a part of it that remained hidden. Not in the files. Not in the reports. But in him. The recorder captured the final moments of that session in silence.
No dramatic ending. No definitive closure.
Just the sound of breathing. The faint hum of electricity. and the presence of something that had taken decades to surface, now fully in the light, but still not entirely understood. Because some stories don't resolve cleanly. Some truths don't arrive whole. They come in fragments. Edges. Shadows. And even when the name is known, when the face is clear, when the past is finally confronted, there are still parts that remain just beyond reach. Waiting. Unspoken. Unfinished. Even now, the confession didn't arrive like a single moment. It didn't crash into the room with clarity or resolution. It unfolded. Slowly. Unevenly. Like something buried too long, forced upward in fragments that refused to align cleanly. By the fifth day, the interrogation had shifted from discovery to consequence. Because now the question was no longer if he had done it. That had already been answered. The question was what it meant. For him. For the case. For everyone who had carried the weight of that night for 25 years without knowing why. The room felt heavier than before. Not with tension, but with something quieter. Finality. The kind that settles in once the truth begins to take shape, even if it's incomplete. He sat in the same position. Hands resting on the table. Eyes focused somewhere between the surface and the past. Less guarded now. But not open. Never fully open. Because even as he spoke, there was always a sense that something remained just beneath the words, something he would never fully give. The detectives adjusted their approach. No longer building toward confession. Now they were mapping it. Understanding sequence. Intent. Aftermath. Every decision, every movement, every second that turned a moment into something irreversible. They returned to the timeline. But this time it wasn't reconstruction. It was confirmation. He followed it.
Piece by piece.
Entering the house. The moment of contact. The escalation. The silence that followed. Each detail placed carefully, as if he were laying out evidence against himself, but only as much as he chose to reveal. Because even now, control hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed form. They asked what he felt.
During.
After. In the years that followed. The question lingered. Longer than most. Because emotion is harder to construct than fact. I didn't think about it, he said finally. Flat. Measured. The answer felt insufficient. Not wrong. But incomplete. Because not thinking isn't the same as not feeling. And the absence of explanation only deepened the unease. They pressed again. Not harder. Just differently. What about afterward? What about the days, the weeks, the years? Another pause. This one different. Less resistant. More reflective. I thought it would come back, he admitted. Quietly. Almost as if the words surprised him. That detail shifted something fundamental. Because for the first time, he wasn't describing the event itself. He was describing its shadow. The part that followed him. I kept waiting, he continued. For someone to show up. For someone to ask. But no one had.
Not then.
Not for a long time. And that absence, the lack of consequence, had become its own kind of reality. Because when nothing happens, you begin to believe nothing will. I thought I got away with it. The sentence landed without resistance.
No pride.
No relief. Just acknowledgement. And in that moment, the full weight of those 25 years became visible. Because getting away with something like that isn't an event. It's a process. A slow transformation. A shift from fear to acceptance to something even more dangerous. Normalcy. He described it without emotion. Going to work. Talking to people. Living a life that, on the surface, gave no indication of what had happened. At first, every sound had meant something. Every unexpected knock. Every car slowing down outside. Every glance that lasted a second too long. Each one carried the possibility that it was over. That it had caught up to him. But it never did. And over time that expectation faded. Replaced by something quieter. Something more permanent. He stopped looking over his shoulder. Stopped waiting. Stopped believing it would ever come back. Until it did. The detectives let that settle. Because this was something they understood but rarely heard articulated. The psychology of time. The way guilt, or the absence of it, changes when it isn't confronted. When it's allowed to exist without consequence. They asked if he had ever considered turning himself in. The question wasn't accusatory. It was exploratory. Trying to understand the boundaries of his thinking. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped again. Fingers tightening slightly against the surface of the table. Then,
No.
simple.
Direct.
Final. And somehow, that single word revealed more than anything else he had said. Because it confirmed that whatever he had carried, it hadn't been enough to break through. Not guilt. Not fear. Not memory. Nothing had been strong enough to force that choice. Instead, he had adapted. Lived around it. Lived with it. Until it became part of something else. Something quieter. Something invisible. The detectives shifted again. Not toward emotion, but toward impact. They spoke about the victim. Her life. Her family. The years that followed. Not as an accusation, but as a reality. A counterweight to everything he had described. For the first time, there was a visible change. Not dramatic. Not immediate.
But there.
A hesitation. A slight shift in posture. A break in the rhythm he had maintained. Because this part wasn't about him. And that made it harder to control. I know, he said.
Soft.
Almost under his breath. But it wasn't clear what he meant. Whether he understood the impact. Or simply acknowledged that it existed. The ambiguity remained. Just like everything else. Outside the room, the case continued to evolve. Prosecutors built their narrative. Evidence aligned. Statements were prepared. The story that had taken decades to uncover was finally being shaped into something that could stand in court. But even as it came together, it carried the same uncertainty that had always defined it. Because the truth, as it existed now, was still incomplete. Not in facts. Not in evidence. But in understanding. Why it happened. Why it escalated. Why nothing afterward had brought it back into the light, until science forced it. Those questions lingered. Unanswered. Possibly unanswerable. Back inside, the interrogation reached a quiet plateau. No new revelations.
No sudden shifts.
Just a steady continuation of what had already been established. And then, near the end of the session, something changed again. Not in what he said, but in how he said it. They would have never found me. The statement came, without hesitation, without doubt. And for a moment it felt like a return to the control he had carried for so long. Because, in a way, he was right. Without the advancement of DNA technology, without genetic genealogy, without the systems that didn't exist in 1998, he might have remained exactly what he had been for decades. Unknown, untouched, unseen. But the moment didn't last, because reality had already overwritten that belief. They had found him. Not through chance, not through error, but through something he could never have predicted. And as that realization settled back in, the control faded again, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance. The recorder continued to run, capturing everything. Not just the words, but the spaces between them. The pauses. The shifts. The moments where truth existed but never fully formed. Because even now, even after everything, this wasn't a clean ending. It wasn't resolution. It was something else. Something heavier. A case that had waited 25 years, now finally moving forward. But carrying with it the same shadows it had always held. Because some things don't disappear when they're solved. They remain. In the questions that were never answered. In the details that were never fully explained. In the silence that lingers even after the truth is spoken. And as the session ended, as the recorder clicked off, as the room returned to stillness, one thing remained clear. This story wasn't finished. Not completely. Not yet. The moment the interrogation ended, the silence that followed felt almost louder than the questions themselves. For 25 years, the case had existed as a mystery. A file. A photograph. A name attached to a tragedy that never received an answer. But now, the mystery had a face. A voice. A confession hidden inside fragments of conversation. And yet, for everyone who had waited for this moment, the truth brought something unexpected. Not relief. Not completely. Because solving a cold case does not erase what happened. It only changes the shape of the pain. For investigators, the work continued. The arrest was only the beginning. A successful DNA match could identify the person responsible, but a conviction required something more. Every detail had to be rebuilt, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence examined again under the harsh light of a courtroom. The past had to be proven, not remembered, not assumed, proven. And that meant returning to where everything started. The house. The street. The neighborhood that had carried the memory of that summer night for decades. When detectives returned, they found a place that looked almost completely different. New cars. New families. New paint on old buildings. The world had moved forward. But beneath the changes, the investigators knew something remained. A moment frozen in time. A place where a person's life ended and another person's secret began. They walked through the neighborhood again, not as investigators searching for clues, but as people trying to understand how it had happened. How someone could enter. How someone could leave. How an entire community could sleep while something terrible unfolded only a few streets away. The answers were uncomfortable. Because the truth was not always dramatic. Sometimes, evil doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly. Sometimes it looks ordinary. That was what shocked people the most about the suspect. Not that he had been found, but that he had been there. Living. Breathing. Existing among everyone else. For years, Neighbors searched their memories. They replayed conversations. They questioned small moments that had seemed meaningless at the time. A simple greeting. A passing encounter. A familiar face at a store.
People wanted there to have been a sign.
Something obvious. Something that would explain how they had missed it. But there was nothing. And that absence created a deeper fear. Because it meant anyone could be carrying something hidden. The investigation moved into a new phase. Reconstructing the victim's final hours. For the family, this was the part they had waited for and feared at the same time. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty. Uncertainty about what happened. Uncertainty about who was responsible. Uncertainty about whether the truth would ever come. Now they had answers. But answers can hurt. Because knowing the truth means facing reality. There was no longer a possibility that she had simply disappeared. No longer a hope that some forgotten detail would change everything. The mystery was gone. Replaced by a painful certainty. Investigators handled every conversation carefully. They knew this was not just a case file. It was a person.
A daughter.
A friend. Someone whose life had existed beyond the moment she became a victim. They revisited who she was before the headlines. Her routines. Her personality. The small details that had been overshadowed by the crime. Because after decades, the world had almost reduced her to one night. And investigators wanted to restore what had been taken. A life. Not just a case. Meanwhile, prosecutors examined the evidence. The DNA. The statements. The timeline. The physical details preserved from 1998. The same evidence that had once seemed powerless had become the foundation of the entire case. Technology had transformed what investigators could do. A sample that sat untouched for years had become the bridge between past and present. A microscopic trace had survived longer than memories. Longer than rumors. Longer than the suspect's confidence that he would never be found. The irony was impossible to ignore. In 1998, the evidence existed. The truth existed. But the tools were not ready. Time had not solved the case. Science had. And that realization sent a shock far beyond California. Because this was not just one arrest. It was a warning. To anyone who believed distance created safety. That decades could erase responsibility. That forgotten meant gone. They were wrong. The suspect had hidden behind years. But years had only given investigators more opportunities to find him. As the legal process moved forward, attention returned to the man himself. Who was he before that night? Who was he afterward? How could someone commit such an act and continue living a seemingly normal life? Those questions followed him everywhere. Experts examined his behavior. Not to excuse it. Not to explain away the damage. But to understand the disturbing reality of how someone could separate one horrific act from an ordinary existence. The answer was unsettling. There was no simple explanation. No single moment that created the person he became. No easy reason that could make sense of something senseless. Because human behavior is rarely simple. And some choices remain impossible to understand, even after the facts are known. Inside the courtroom, the story would eventually be presented piece by piece. The jury would hear about the night in 1998. The investigation. The years of silence. The breakthrough. The DNA that ended the wait. But behind all those facts was something much larger. A question that had followed the case from the beginning. How many other cases were still waiting? how many families were still looking at old photographs, hoping for answers. How many pieces of evidence sat quietly in storage, waiting for technology to catch up. The California case became a symbol of something powerful. Cold cases are not always dead cases. Sometimes they are simply unfinished. The passage of time can make people believe a story has ended. But evidence does not forget. A fingerprint. A fiber. A trace of DNA. Small pieces of a much larger truth. Pieces that can survive decades. The suspect had spent years believing the past was behind him. But the past had never left. It was there in the evidence room. There in the database. There in the unanswered questions of a family that refused to stop remembering. And now, finally, it had reached him. The community watched as the case moved toward its final chapter. Some felt relief. Some felt anger. Some felt a strange mixture of both. Because justice arriving late creates complicated emotions. 25 years is a lifetime. A child could be born, grow up, and become an adult in that amount of time. Entire generations could change. But one family remained connected to a single night. A single loss. A single unanswered question.
Until now.
The cold case was no longer cold. The name was no longer unknown. The evidence had finally spoken. But even after the breakthrough, even after the arrest, even after the world learned the truth, the memory of that summer night remained. A reminder that some moments never disappear. They wait. Quietly. Patiently. Until someone finally listens. And when the truth finally emerges after decades of silence. It does not arrive gently. It arrives like a storm, changing everything it touches, leaving behind answers, leaving behind pain, and leaving behind a story that would never again be forgotten. The courtroom doors opened, and with them came the final stage of a journey that had begun 25 years earlier. A journey that started with a silent house in California. A neighborhood frozen by fear. A family left with questions that had no answers. And a small piece of evidence that waited patiently for the world to catch up. Now, decades later, the story was no longer about searching. It was about proving. Inside the courtroom, everything was different. The mystery that once surrounded the case had been replaced by facts. The unknown figure who existed only in old reports and unanswered questions now sat in front of everyone. A real person. A real face. A name attached to the evidence. But for those who had followed the case from the beginning, seeing him there created a strange feeling. Because the man sitting at the defense table did not look like the monster people had imagined for 25 years.
He looked ordinary.
And that was the part people struggled with the most. The most frightening stories are not always about people who look dangerous. Sometimes they are about people who look like everyone else. People who walk through neighborhoods. People who smile at strangers. People who return home at night and close the door behind them. The prosecution began building its case. Slowly.
Carefully.
They understood that this was not just a trial. It was the final reconstruction of a story that had remained incomplete for decades. They started with the beginning. The night in 1998. The emergency call. The arrival of investigators. The discovery that changed everything. Photographs appeared. Documents were reviewed. Evidence collected from a scene that had become one of the oldest unresolved mysteries in the region. The jury listened. The community listened. And for the first time, the entire story was being told from beginning to end. Not through rumors. Not through speculation. but through evidence. The DNA became the center of everything. A detail invisible to the human eye. A trace left behind without intention. For years, it had represented uncertainty. A question waiting for an answer. Now, it represented something else. A connection. A bridge between 1998 and the present. The prosecution explained how technology had changed the investigation, how genetic genealogy transformed a forgotten sample into a path forward. A path that led investigators through family connections, historical records, and countless possibilities until only one person remained. The suspect. The man who had spent decades believing the past was finished. The defense challenged the process. They questioned the timeline. They questioned interpretations. They questioned whether the evidence alone could tell the entire story. And in some ways, they were right about one thing. Evidence tells what happened. But it does not always explain why. And that question remained. Why did this happen? Why that night? Why that person? Even after the arrest. Even after the DNA match. Even after the confession fragments. Some questions remained trapped in the space between fact and understanding. The victim's family sat through every moment. Every piece of testimony. Every painful detail. For them, this was not a story about science. Not about investigation techniques. Not about headlines. It was about someone they loved. Someone whose future was taken away. Someone whose name had spent years connected to a tragedy she never chose. They had waited decades for this moment. But waiting for justice does not make the process easy. Because justice arrives carrying the weight of everything that happened before it. Every birthday missed. Every holiday without her. Every moment when the family wondered if the person responsible would ever be found. The courtroom became a place where 25 years of silence finally had a voice. Former investigators returned to describe the early days. The frustration. The dead ends. The night spent reviewing evidence that offered no answers. They remembered the case when it was still active. Before it became a cold case. Before people stopped asking questions. Before the world moved on. They described how difficult it was to accept that the evidence existed, but the technology did not yet exist to unlock it. The answer had been there all along. Hidden in plain sight. Waiting. That became one of the most powerful parts of the case. The idea that time had not destroyed the truth. It had protected it. The years that passed did not erase the evidence. They gave investigators new ways to understand it. Outside the courthouse, reactions continued. People who had lived in the community for decades watched closely. Some remembered the original fear. The uncertainty. The feeling that someone dangerous had disappeared into everyday life. Others were seeing the story for the first time. A new generation learning about an old crime. A reminder that some cases never truly disappear. They simply wait for the right moment. During testimony, the suspect's own words became one of the most important elements. Not because they explained everything. They didn't. But because they confirmed enough. Enough to connect the past and present. Enough to show that the person responsible had not been a stranger to the evidence. He had been the source of it. The same person who believed he had escaped accountability had unknowingly carried the key to his own downfall. The DNA. The one thing he could not erase. The one thing he could not control. The one thing that survived when everything else faded. As the trial continued, the courtroom returned again and again to the same theme.
Time.
25 years. A number that represented more than a delay. It represented lives changed. A family aging without answers. Investigators growing older while carrying an unfinished case. A community learning to live beside a mystery. And a suspect living with the belief that the mystery would remain forever. But time had not been on his side. It had been collecting evidence against him. Every year. Every technological advancement. Every new method of investigation. All of it moving toward the same moment. The moment when silence ended. The final arguments approached. The prosecution described a case built across decades. A crime committed in the past. A truth revealed in the present. The defense argued uncertainty. But uncertainty was no longer enough. Because the evidence had survived. The DNA had survived. The victim's memory had survived. And now, after decades of waiting, the courtroom prepared to decide what happened next. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters prepared their final headlines. The phrase that had followed the case for years appeared again. Cold case solved. But behind those words was a much deeper story. A story about patience.
About loss.
About the power of evidence. And about the fact that some secrets can hide for a very long time. But they cannot hide forever. When the jury finally prepared to deliver its decision, the courtroom fell silent. The same silence that had surrounded the case for decades. But this time it was different. This silence was not uncertainty. It was anticipation. Because everyone knew the moment had arrived. The final answer. The final judgment. The end of a question that had lasted longer than anyone expected. And after 25 years, the past was finally ready to speak. The courtroom waited. A room filled with decades of memories. A room where old photographs, forgotten reports, and silent evidence had finally come together to tell a story that refused to disappear. For years, the case had existed in uncertainty. A question without an answer. A name without a suspect. A family searching for something they feared they might never find. But now, every person inside that courtroom understood one thing. The moment had arrived. After 25 years, the California cold case had reached its final confrontation. The jury entered. The room became completely still. No movement.
No whispers. No distractions.
Only the sound of footsteps approaching a decision that had been decades in the making. The defendant sat quietly. The same controlled expression he had carried throughout the trial remained on his face. But those watching closely noticed something different. A small change. A hesitation. Because no matter how long someone believes they have escaped the past, there comes a moment when the past stands directly in front of them. And there is nowhere left to go. The verdict was read.
Guilty.
The word landed with the weight of years. 25 years of unanswered questions. 25 years of wondering. 25 years of a family carrying a pain that never had a name attached to it. Now it did. The courtroom reacted quietly. There was no dramatic outburst.
No celebration.
Because moments like this are rarely simple. Justice can arrive. But it cannot return what was lost. It cannot restore the years that disappeared. It cannot erase memories of what should have been. For the victim's family, the verdict represented something they had waited for longer than anyone should have to wait. Recognition. The world finally acknowledged what they had known all along. That a life had been taken. That someone was responsible. That their loved one had not been forgotten. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The story that had once been buried in old archives was suddenly everywhere again. California 1998 cold case solved. The headline traveled quickly. But behind the headline was a much larger message. A reminder that cold cases are not always abandoned. Sometimes they are simply unfinished. The investigation that had once reached a dead end had become a model for what modern technology could accomplish. A case solved not because someone suddenly remembered, not because a witness appeared after decades, but because evidence had survived. The DNA collected in 1998 had waited quietly while the world changed around it. The technology that could not solve the case then eventually became the key to solving it later. That reality fascinated investigators because it challenged the idea that time always works against justice. Sometimes, time creates new opportunities. Every year brought better tools. Every advancement created another possibility. And every piece of evidence preserved from the original investigation became more valuable. The suspect had counted on time. But time became the thing that exposed him. After the verdict, attention returned to the victim. Not the crime. Not the investigation. The person. Friends remembered her before the tragedy. They remembered her personality. Her kindness. The ordinary moments that had nothing to do with the case. Because for decades, the public knew her mainly through a headline. But she had been much more than that. She had been a person with plans, with dreams, with people who loved her. The trial brought back those memories. And for many, that was the most important part. Restoring her identity, making sure she was remembered for the life she lived, not only the way it ended. Meanwhile, investigators reflected on the journey. Some of the original detectives had retired before seeing the case solved. Some never got the chance to witness the final chapter. But their work mattered. The evidence they collected. The decisions they made. The patience they showed when answers seemed impossible. Without those early efforts, there would have been nothing for modern technology to uncover. The future solved the case. But the past preserved it. That combination changed everything. The case also changed the way people viewed forensic investigation. Before, many believed that if a crime remained unsolved for years, the chances of finding the truth disappeared. This case challenged that belief. It showed that evidence can have a longer memory than people. A person can forget. A witness can disappear. A story can become distorted. But a scientific trace remains. Waiting. The suspect's life after the crime became another subject of public fascination. How had he lived for so long? How had he maintained an appearance of normality? How could someone carry a secret that heavy and continue moving through the world? There were no easy answers. Because the most unsettling part of cases like this is not always the crime itself. It is the ordinary moments afterward. The mornings. The conversations. The years. The ability of someone to separate one terrible act from the rest of their existence. That reality disturbed many people. Because it challenged the way we imagine criminals. People often expect danger to look obvious. To announce itself. To stand apart. But sometimes it hides behind routine, behind familiarity, behind a face people never thought twice about. That was the lesson many took from this case. Not fear. Awareness. The understanding that the smallest details matter. That every investigation leaves behind a story. And that every unanswered question deserves the possibility of an answer. Months after the verdict, the neighborhood continued changing. Life returned to normal. Children played outside. Cars passed through streets that once carried fear. New residents moved into homes without knowing the history beneath them. But for those who remembered, the street was never just a street. The house was never just a house. It was the place where a mystery began. And decades later, where a mystery finally ended. The evidence room where the original DNA sample had been stored became a symbol of patience. A reminder that justice does not always move quickly. Sometimes it moves slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until the right moment arrives. Then, everything changes. The case that once seemed impossible became proof that impossible does not always mean forever. Because the phrase cold case can sound like an ending. But sometimes, it is only a pause. A pause before science catches up. A pause before a hidden truth becomes visible. A pause before someone who thought they were forgotten discovers they were never truly gone. The final chapter of the California 1998 case was not written by revenge. It was written by persistence. By investigators who refused to completely let go. By technology that opened doors once believed permanently closed. By evidence that survived longer than anyone expected. And by a family that continued carrying a memory through decades of uncertainty. The verdict closed one chapter. But the story left behind something larger. A warning. A promise. A message sent to every person connected to an unsolved case. Time may pass. Years may disappear. People may move on. But the truth has a way of waiting. It waits in old files. In forgotten evidence. In tiny fragments no one can see. And when the moment comes, when the right discovery is made, the past returns. Not quietly. Not gently. But with the force of everything that has been waiting to be found. 25 years later, a question finally had an answer. A family finally had justice. And a cold case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved became proof that no secret stays buried forever. The verdict ended the trial. But it did not end the questions. Because even after the courtroom doors closed, even after the headlines faded, even after the world learned the identity of the person responsible, one thing remained impossible to ignore. A cold case solved does not mean a story forgotten. For the people who lived through it, the case was never just a headline. It was 25 years of waiting. 25 years of wondering. 25 years of waking up every morning with the same unanswered question.
Why?
And now, after the justice system had spoken, the community was left with something it had wanted for decades. But something it was still learning how to accept. The truth. The days after the verdict were filled with reflection. Investigators reviewed the case one more time, not because they doubted the outcome, but because cases like this become part of the people who solve them. They remember the first night. The first photograph. The first piece of evidence. The first moment they realized this would not be an ordinary investigation. In 1998, nobody knew they were looking at a case that would outlive careers. Nobody knew the answer would take decades. Nobody knew a tiny trace left behind at the crime scene would eventually become the weapon that brought the truth back. At the time, investigators were fighting against limitations. Technology was different. Resources were different. The tools available could reveal only part of the story. They had evidence, but they did not yet have the ability to fully understand it. And that became one of the most remarkable parts of the case. The evidence had been there from the beginning. The truth had been waiting. Not hidden. Not destroyed. Just beyond reach. The advancement of forensic science changed everything. Years later, methods that investigators in 1998 could only imagine became reality. DNA databases expanded. Genetic genealogy opened new paths. Unknown samples could become family connections. Family connections could become names. And names could become answers. A process that once seemed impossible became the turning point. But behind every technological breakthrough was something else. Patience. Because science alone does not solve a case. People do. People who preserve evidence. People who reopen files. People who look again when everyone else believes there is nothing left to find. That was the true story behind the California case. A combination of time, technology, and determination. The suspect had spent decades believing the silence protected him. But the silence had actually preserved the path leading back to him. The community continued processing what had happened. For some residents, the arrest brought relief. For others, it created a new kind of fear. Because the person responsible had not been a stranger from another world. He had been someone who existed in the same society. Someone who had walked through the same streets. Someone who had watched the years pass just like everyone else. That reality was difficult to understand. People often imagine criminals as obvious, as different, as easily recognizable. But life does not always work that way. Sometimes the person connected to the darkest moments can appear completely ordinary. And that was what disturbed many people the most. Not that he had been found, but that he had been there all along. The victim's family faced their own complicated emotions. Justice had arrived. But grief does not disappear because a verdict is announced. A courtroom decision cannot restore lost time. It cannot bring back conversations that never happened. It cannot return birthdays, holidays, or ordinary moments that were stolen forever. Closure is often misunderstood. People imagine closure as an ending, a final page, a complete disappearance of pain. But real closure is different. Sometimes it is simply the ability to finally understand what happened. To replace uncertainty with truth. To stop searching. To finally know. And after 25 years, the family no longer had to wonder who was responsible. They knew. The investigation also revealed something important about memory. How communities remember. How stories survive. For years, the victim's name remained connected to a mystery. But after the case was solved, people began talking about her differently. Not only about what happened, but about who she was. That mattered. Because victims are often remembered through the worst moment of their lives. But they were people before tragedy. They had dreams, relationships, personal histories. They had ordinary days that mattered. The final years of the investigation became a reminder that solving crimes is not only about identifying offenders. It is also about restoring dignity to those who were lost. The case became part of a larger conversation about unsolved crimes across the country. Families of other victims watched closely. They saw what happened in California and wondered the same thing. Could their case be next? Could old evidence finally speak? Could technology uncover what time had hidden? For many, the answer became hope. Because every cold case represents more than a file. It represents someone waiting. Someone who deserves answers. Someone whose story is unfinished. The phrase cold case often creates the impression of something frozen forever. But this case showed something different. Cold does not mean dead. Silent does not mean forgotten. Unsolved does not mean impossible. The evidence from 1998 had survived because someone believed it might matter someday. And someday finally arrived. Years after the arrest, investigators continued studying the case. Not because they questioned the verdict, but because every case leaves behind lessons. What worked? What failed? What could be improved? The California investigation became an example of how old cases can be transformed by modern methods. A reminder that criminal investigations do not exist only in the present. They exist across time. A detective in 1998 and a forensic scientist decades later can become partners without ever meeting. One collects the evidence. Another discovers what that evidence means. Together, they complete the story. The suspect's decades of freedom became one of the most unsettling parts of the case, because he had experienced the world believing he had escaped. But every day after the crime was another day lived under the shadow of evidence he could not see. The truth was always there, waiting. The final years of the case showed something powerful: that justice does not always arrive when people expect it. Sometimes it arrives when people have almost stopped believing. Sometimes it comes after careers end, after technology changes, after an entire generation grows up. But when it comes, it changes everything. The California 1998 cold case became more than a solved investigation. It became a story about time, about memory, about the invisible connection between the past and the present. A story proving that the smallest clue can become the loudest voice, and that the secrets people believe they have buried may only be waiting for the right moment to return. Because every crime leaves something behind.
A mark.
A trace. A piece of truth. And no matter how many years pass, truth does not age. It waits. And eventually,
it speaks.
The courtroom drama reached its deafening crescendo under the blazing lights of a packed California courthouse on a crisp autumn morning in 2026, where the federal and state prosecutors laid out their final, devastating closing arguments before a tense, spellbound jury that had spent weeks absorbing an overwhelming avalanche of forensic evidence, digital timelines, and harrowing witness testimonies that methodically dismantled every single lie the defense had constructed over the decades, painting an unsparing, cinematic portrait of a cold-blooded execution meticulously planned and executed in the shadows of 1998, while the defendant sat at the defense table staring blankly ahead, acutely aware that the invisible net woven by modern genetic genealogy and relentless police tenacity had finally tightened around his throat with the crushing inevitability of a hydraulic press, sealing his fate as the gallery held its collective breath in absolute silence, waiting for the words that would officially close a 28-year chapter of agony and unanswered questions, a monumental legal victory that vindicated the tireless efforts of cold case detectives who had refused to let the victim's memory be swallowed by the dust of time, transforming a forgotten file into a landmark precedent for criminal justice. Across the entire United States, proving once and for all that no matter how sophisticated a killer's cover story might be, and no matter how many years they manage to hide behind a facade of normalcy, science and human persistence will eventually drag them out of the dark and force them to face the blinding, merciless reality of their own unforgivable crimes, leaving an indelible mark on the history of true crime jurisprudence and offering a glimmer of enduring hope to thousands of other families still waiting in the shadows for their own long-overdue moment of truth. As the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open to release the murmuring press corps and exhausted spectators into the fading California sunlight, the final chapter of this decades-long nightmare formally closed, yet the lingering resonance of the verdict continued to vibrate through the corridors of the justice system like a persistent ghost refusing to be laid to rest, serving as a permanent, chilling monument to the enduring fragility of human life and the relentless pursuit of accountability that defines the very best of modern investigative resolve, while the coastal fog rolled back in from the Pacific just as it had on that fateful night in 1998, wrapping its cold, damp arms around a suburban landscape that had finally been cleansed of the dark secret it harbored for nearly 30 years, leaving behind a solemn reminder that no crime, no matter how carefully engineered or how deeply buried beneath the sands of time, can forever escape the unblinking eye of science and the unyielding dedication of those who refuse to let the victims of the shadows be forgotten by a world too quick to look the other way, sealing an unforgettable legacy of suspense, tragedy, and ultimate redemption that will forever haunt the annals of American true crime history as a testament to the unbreakable power of truth.